Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Shannon, and thank you, LCHA, for having me today. I'm really humbled by the turnout for tonight's lecture, and I am really excited to be able to tell these stories today. Um, so first of all, thank you to Shannon and LCHA. Um, Special thank you to Kevin Johnson of the Penobscot Marine Museum for assisting me with some photographs. Dr. Amy Keithan, James Tanzer for help with research and editing everything. And special thank you to viewers like you, like they say on PBS, because honestly, we couldn't do these programs if people didn't have interest in it. So thank you so much. Um, in this lecture, I'll be focusing on a few little known histories of Black men who have worked the waters of Maine's Lincoln County, whether by choice or by not. Black and Indigenous sailors have been a part of the landscape of Maine since the beginning, and the importance of Maine waterways is still seen today with Abenaki place names such as the Kennebec River. Of course, the stories in today's talk represent just a small sampling of the important roles Black and Indigenous men played in Maine's maritime history. I've been interested in maritime history from a young age. I remember seeing a replica of the Pilgrim from 2 years before the mast when I was young, and I've been living in Maine for about 8 years now, and being constantly surrounded by such tangible history has really made me want to research and learn all I can. And as someone who's interested in social history and particularly the histories of marginalized people, I'm always excited when I can bring these stories to the forefront. Like Shannon mentioned, part of my volunteer work for LCHA includes researching the jail records for the 1811 Old Jail in Wiscasset and interpreting the stories of the people in those records. There were quite a number of sailors that were held there, numerous people of color, and many more women. It is my hope that including stories of these people in the current tour materials at the old jail helps to bring a richer interpretation that more visitors can connect with. I also do research and give tours at the Pownborough Courthouse. There, my interest is in Revolutionary War history and maritime history. So if you come visit us this summer, I will tell you all about it. So during this talk, I'll be using the words perhaps and likely a lot to fill in the gaps of the records using my own research into sailing and life in the 18th and 19th centuries. The sources on the enslaved men and women in New England are slim, just because the enslaved were not valued as people, but instead as commodities. Even in the case of Captain Zina Lewis, who is a free man of color, whom I'll be discussing later, the records are few, either due to benign neglect or the belief that these records are of little importance to the greater historical record. The sources for all of these people are hard to find, but they are there. The COVID pandemic of 2020, as we know, brought the world to a standstill. And with archives closed around the world, researchers needed a remote way to access the sources they used. This really brought into focus the need for the digitization of records. The effort into the digitization of records has increased in recent years, which has been awesome for researchers, and has made history vastly more accessible to anyone with an internet connection. In particular, the digitization of newspapers, which provide a crucial narrative about Captain Zena Lewis that we wouldn't have had today if we only had to rely on sources like census records. All of the research I've conducted for this talk today has been entirely online with digitized records, which truly shows the need for digitized and accessible records. Also, I'd like to mention that I will be talking about what was considered historic Lincoln County. So places like Gardner and Bath, which at one point were part of Lincoln County, but over time became incorporated into separate counties. But for now, we will start in Dresden, formerly known as Pownborough. A place which I'm sure many of you connected to Lincoln County Historical Association are familiar with, as it is the location of one of LCHA's properties, the 1761 Pownborough Courthouse. This is a picture in June. You can come check it out. The Bailey Parson Rose or Parson Bailey Rose, all in bloom. Beautiful. So if you've driven Route 128 in Dresden, perhaps on the way to visit the courthouse, you'll have noticed the stately red Georgian home on the banks of the tidal Kennebec River. As you come down the rise of the road, the red house bordered by red trees and rolling fields with the river rolling past in the background, you might wonder who lived there. You might also know that this house once belonged to Captain James Patterson, who sailed on the Kennebec River as early as 1755. What you might not know is that Captain Patterson, like many well-off men of his era, enslaved a man of African descent who likely worked alongside him on many of his journeys up and down the river and to ports as far away as Boston. Enslaved men and women labored at domestic work, farm work, and often whatever industry their enslavers were involved in. In Captain Patterson's case, the man he enslaved was involved with shipping as well. Patterson's vessel, aptly named the Kennebec, was a freighter, bringing supplies from Boston to the rural community of Pownborough. With an outlet to the sea, the Kennebec River allowed people and goods on ships to flow easily between large ports like Boston and Salem with the interior of the District of Maine. The man enslaved by Captain Patterson probably would have been engaged in much of the sailing work, like handling the sails, hauling anchor, as well as loading and unloading cargo. It is possible he would have been the cook and steward as well, as these were typical employment for Black men on board ship. And he may have indeed been the only other crew member of the Kennebec besides Patterson. Disaster struck in 1768 when James Patterson's ship, carrying passengers from Pownborough who had journeyed to Boston to secure needed provisions for the long winter ahead, became the victim of a particularly violent winter storm. The ship Kennebec wrecked on a tiny island in Muscongas Bay, which is now called Wreck Island, about 4 miles offshore of Friendship, Maine. Reverend Jacob Bailey, local minister, well-versed with the goings-on in Pownborough, wrote of the tragedy in correspondence to a friend. He wrote that every soul, being 12 in number, perished. The party all belonged to this town. Here's a little clip from it. He writes, quote, Captain Patterson was cast away near George's on Sunday night, the 4th of this month, when every soul, being 12 in number, perished. The party all belonged to this town, among which were Mr. Perrin, a young merchant and violent enemy to the church, Mr. Chapman and Barker, Captain Fitch's wife. By this accident, 5 or 6 families are broken up, and no less than 32 children left fatherless or motherless. Beside this vessel had on board great part of the provision designed for the supply of our settlement. To the value of 2,000 or 3,000 pounds is lost. The loss was so complete and devastating that it was even reported on in the Boston Gazette in December of 1768. The Gazette article, I won't read this whole thing, but the Gazette article mentions that, quote, nothing of great value was saved, end quote, and that, quote, every person perished, including a Negro man belonging to the captain, end quote. This single reference is the one and only mention of the man enslaved by Captain Patterson. Often records of the enslaved are just like this, frustratingly incomplete. And finding these sorts of records often leads to more questions than answers. As we saw, Bailey writes that because of the shipwreck, 5 or 6 families were broken up and no less than 32 children left without a parent, end quote. Did the enslaved man have a family, someone who mourned his loss as well? Sadly, I've yet to uncover even this man's name, but it doesn't diminish the fact that he existed, worked, and lived, and his story is just as important and worth telling. Like the man enslaved by Captain Patterson, Boston Miller was likely engaged in much of the same work at sea. Boston was a man of African descent who was enslaved by ship owner, builder, and Captain William Miller of Damariscotta and Booth Bay. And like the man enslaved by Captain Patterson, Boston Miller may have made up the permanent crew of Captain Miller's vessels. He would have probably been involved with handling sails, loading and unloading cargo. It is possible, too, that he would have been tasked with shipbuilding, which involved hard labor and would have required strong woodworking skills. Boston made an attempt at self-emancipation, which is a term that we use for a person of African descent running away or escaping their enslavers. He made an attempt at self-emancipation in 1762, and William Miller immediately placed an advert in the newspaper, the Boston Postboy, calling for his capture and return. In a time when sources relating to the enslaved were few, a runaway advert like this provides a goldmine of information about Boston. I'll go ahead and read that. $20 reward. Ran away from his master, William Miller, of Walpole and Damariscotta, at the eastern part of this government, on the 20th day of June past, a Negro man named Boston. He is of large stature, no mark on him except one of his great toes was frozen, cut off. The clothes he carried away with him were a coat of light color with white metal buttons, a brown jacket, a pair of trousers, a woolen shirt, hat, and cap. Whoever shall apprehend the said Negro and bring him to his said master, or confine him in any of his majesty's jails, and send word as foresaid, shall have £6 lawful money reward, and all necessary charges paid by William Miller. All masters of vessels and others are hereby cautioned against harboring, concealing, or carrying off the said Negro, as they would avoid the penalty of the law. And that's Walpole, June 21st, 1762. And here's a picture of Walpole and Madame Riscata. Unlike the man enslaved by Captain Patterson who perished in the 1768 shipwreck, Boston Miller's story has a much more positive ending. Looking at the probate inventory of Captain Miller's estate when he died in 1773, this is basically the probate inventory is basically a person's goods once they die, sort of like the last will. This is everything that he's owned. We see his belongings. I've underlined here 3 Negroes and 1 sloop at 97 tons. So we know he's a shipbuilder and he owns 3 human beings. These 3 people are Boston, his wife Dinah, and their child Cuff. After Captain Miller died, ownership of these 3 people went to his wife. And we don't know exactly when Boston was able to be emancipated with his wife and child, but we do know that in July 10th of 1792, quote, Boston Miller of said Bristol, yeoman, end quote, purchased 100 acres of land on the west side of the Kennebec River at Bristol Mills. And he sold a portion of this lot to be used as a schoolhouse in 1807. This is from the Maine genealogist about early families of color in Bristol. And here's a picture of the Bristol Mills area. Boston farmed his land and died a free man. His son Cuff obtained title to the property sometime before 1810. Here's a picture of Cuff's headstone, still extant in Bristol. Cuff never went to sea, but he worked the land he owned in Bristol and had 2 children named Diana and Charles. Interestingly, I found that Diana goes on to marry a man named William Swain of Bath, who is listed as a sailor in various censuses. Before Cuff died in 1846, he sold the family homestead to his son, quote, reserving to myself the use and occupancy of the said premises for and during my natural life, and to marry my wife, the use and occupancy of 1/2 of said premises during her natural life, end quote. Here is a map of the Bristol Mills area, and we see William Swain, Diana's husband, So William Swain, who is Diana's husband, Charles Miller right there, and another free man of color named Boston Brackett. Surely this was a tight-knit community, much like the free Black community of East Brunswick. The Swains went on to have many more children, and the Bracketts likewise. Throughout years of toil and strife, these families found happiness. And surely these families had all the same good grit that carried their ancestors, like the once enslaved Boston Miller, through difficult times. Based on New England ads placed by enslavers for men who self-emancipated, many enslaved men sought freedom apparently so by water. As we saw in the previous ad placed by William Miller, all masters of vessels were constant against concealing said runaway. And described in these adverts are the clothes, which the self-emancipating men were wearing at the time of their departure. And we can see in this ad here, some of them seem to be wearing clothes commonly worn by sailors at the time. So such is the case with an enslaved man named Adam, who self-emancipated from John Merrill of Topsham in July of 1764. Adam is described as wearing a, quote, blue round tail outside jacket, a striped woolen shirt, a red underjacket, brown breeches, ticken trousers, blue stockings, and a pair of pumps, end quote. Here we have an illustration. This is from a broadside published in 1790. And this sailor is wearing really similar clothes described by what is worn by Adam. We have a round tail outside jacket. It doesn't have rounded at the end. It doesn't have like tails. He's wearing a red underjacket and what's interesting, pumps instead of boots. Additionally, the illustration shows these are white chicken trousers, which these are commonly worn by sailors to protect the breeches against the garment. They're also worn by like blacksmith. Anybody who's doing a lot of really dirty jobs would be wearing these sort of trousers over their regular breeches to keep them nice. And I mentioned this as an example of how we can make an educated guess at Adam's profession, whether it was something he chose for himself or it was something that was chose for him by his enslaver. The sea was not only a means of making a living, but also a means for escape. Oh, sorry. With the American Revolution came the chance at freedom as the country was awash in talk of liberty and justice for all. No, I did want this slide, sorry. Many men of color enlisted willingly, like Cicero, who was enslaved by Borough Judge Jonathan Bowman and went off with the Lincoln County Riflemen to Cambridge with the intent to join the Continental Army in the year 1775. This is an ad placed by Jonathan Bowman, says, deserted from the subscriber on the last instant, a Negro man named Cicero, a straight-limbed, likely fellow, about 21 years of age. He had on when he went away a light-colored sateen jacket lined with striped homespun, pair of sheepskin breeches, a check woolen shirt, a pair of light mixed worsted stockings ribbed, a beaver hat, pair of half boots, and also took with him a blue turnout coat with white metal buttons. I do therefore promise a reward of $10 to any person who will apprehend the said Negro and secure him in any jail within any of the United Colonies, to be paid upon receiving information thereof, and will further pay all necessary expense attending the Jonathan Boatman, Borough, November 6, 1775. And the postscript at the bottom says, it is supposed that as he went off in company with the riflemen, he intended to join the army. And he was later apprehended in Cambridge by Reuben Colburn. So some other men might have been coerced to join the war effort by their enslavers. Some men in the latter category may have found themselves unexpectedly sailing a continental frigate up Lincoln County Sheepskin River in the summer of 1777. The continental frigates Boston and Hancock saw action in the Gulf of Maine in the late spring of 1777, capturing several ships as prizes of war. Early in July, however, the Boston and Hancock engaged 3 British naval vessels, the HMS Flora, HMS Victor, and HMS Rainbow. When he realized he was outgunned, the captain of the Boston, Hector McNeil, fled from the battle and made for the Sheepskin River. The frigate remained in the Sheepskin River for about a month, and while she was there, the Hancock was captured by the British. So if you're familiar at all with the Sheepskin River in Wiscasset, it's hard to imagine such a huge ship in the river, but there were a number of large frigates that patrolled the river during the Revolutionary War. So, for example, here is the 1608 Pinnace Virginia, Maine's first ship. She overwintered in the Sheepskin River. Here she is, and quite a small ship. So you can imagine just the giant frigates up and down that small river here. And so anyway, because of Captain McNeil's decision to not aid the Hancock in battle, Captain McNeil was court-martialed upon the frigate Boston's return to Massachusetts. Crew lists for the Continental Navy can be found online. And if you're familiar enough with the names of enslaved men of African descent, a lot of names should stand out to you. On the crew list for the frigate Boston, which I have here, we see several sailors with names common given to the enslaved in the 18th century. So we have here Hampshire Dodge, and we see that he is assigned to gun crew number 10. The Boston was a 24-gun frigate, meaning she had 12 cannons on either side, so 12 on larboard, 12 on starboard. Hampshire Dodge's assignment on gun 10 would have meant he would been assisting with loading the cannon and lighting it during battle, and this would not have been an easy task on the open water. Other men of color on the Boston's crew include, we have Cato Austin, right here, who's assigned to gun number 1, and Scipio Brown, right here, and Caesar Fairweather, right here, whose duties were to, quote, hand powder main and fore hatchway, end quote, meaning that they're handing gunpowder to the cannons on the gun deck, which was a particularly dangerous job. You're having to dodge the cannon recoil. It's very busy. It's very loud. It's dark. It's a lot going on. We have another man here named Pomp Peters, who's also assigned to a gun, this one on gun number 8. And we have this man here, Boston Pitts, who is assigned, quote, 4 braces, etc., end quote. His duty on ship was to attend the ropes around the mast at the fore of the ship, so the front of the ship, that rotate the yards on the sails to catch the wind at different directions. So Boston may have had some experience at sea, as he was given a battle assignment involving some degree of seamanship. The men assigned to the gun crews possibly had less or even no seafaring experience at all. And judging from the battle station assignments, which we can see here, there seems to have been no hierarchy between the white men and men of African descent on the ship. Everyone, regardless of color, worked side by side. Oh, excuse me. The first United States federal census was taken in 1790, and census records provide a wealth of information, especially with regards to maritime centers like Bath. By 1850, these U.S. censuses listed not only heads of household, but all family members and their occupations. And census records are such a great way to see who's living next to each other, who's living with each other. It includes everybody's profession, age, color. They're such a great study tool for finding history. So in these Black families in Bath in 1850, the occupation of most men was mariner. So right here I have, this is the Lewis family. So we have Thomas Lewis, he's a laborer. His wife Esther Lewis, son Zena Lewis, listed as a sailor, and son James Lewis, also listed as a sailor. If we look down here too, we have John Atkins, also lives nearby. He's listed as a pilot, which is somebody that would be navigating boats up and down different stretches of land. So he's also a seafarer. Some, as we see, some are sons of heads of households who are sailors. So for black men without land, sailor was the surest bet of an occupation. Bob Greene, who, as we might be familiar with, is a notable historian with roots in Maine stretching back 8 generations, writes in the book Maine's Visible Black History that in the Black community, sailing was a career. He goes on to say that, quote, where white sailors were young boys doing that one fling before settling down with the girl next door, Black sailors, for the most part, were older and they were breadwinners, end quote. He adds that, quote, once you were on the water or on the open sea, color made no difference. It was based on availability. If you were good, it made no difference what your color was, and it was rewarded with money the same way, end quote. Like we saw on the frigate Boston during the Revolutionary War, everyone worked together regardless of color. And we can see how important these industries are for men at a time that afforded them very little opportunities elsewhere. According to W. Jeffrey Bolster in his book Blackjacks, 25% of mariners before the Civil War were Black. And according to the 1850 census, quote, all of the related maritime industries were combined under stevedores, fishermen, stewards, and shipwright, and represented more than 50% of the Black population, end quote. However, being a free Black sailor in a time when slavery was very much legal in the Southern states did not come without its own dangers. Here we have a Seaman's Protection Certificate. This is issued to Moses Griffin of Brunswick on a trip to New Orleans. Seaman's Protection Certificates were issued by custom houses and notaries beginning in 1796 as a response to the British Navy's impressment of American sailors. Basically, the British Navy was going around impressing, gang pressing American sailors. So these were sort of like protection that says, I'm an American citizen, I'm not a member of the British Navy. So these were important documents for any sailor, but especially so for free Black men traveling to Southern and foreign parts. If you'll notice here, after Moses's Griffin name, the notary has made an important notation that he is a free man of color. So this whole document says that's a notary from New Orleans, basically attesting that Moses Griffin was indeed born in America, and that he is a free man of color. which in New Orleans, you definitely want that important distinction. So for our last story, we'll travel down the road a bit to Bath, which was part of Lincoln County until 1854. So, and where we will meet a remarkable Black sailor named Zena Lewis. So here are the protection certificates issued for Zena and his brother his brother John Lewis, who were both mariners born in Gardner. As Gardner didn't have a customs house or a customs collector, the Lewises would have gone to their nearest large port to register with their customs collector and receive a certificate. And so Bath would have been the closest to Gardner. You can see the certificates here were issued in the Port of Bath, Lincoln County, Port of Bath, and signed by the customs collector. So what custom houses were is they would oversee the import and export of goods, and they would collect duties or taxes on imported goods. They were also in charge of issuing out the sailors' seamen's protection certificates. So Zena and John would have traveled to the custom house to retrieve a protection certificate, much like you would go to the post office or a courthouse to obtain the passport today. Zena and John Lewis's father, Thomas Lewis, was also a sailor. And this is one interesting example of this pull to the sea that many Black families felt over generations. Surely sailing was in the Lewis family's blood. So here's the crew list for the Argonaut. We can see here everybody has their name, their rank, place of birth, place of residence, age, complexion, which is an important thing we want to look at. So we have Thomas Lewis of Gardner. He lives in Gardner. He's 21 years old, 5'4", and he is a Black man. So Thomas unfortunately dies in 1856, and among the goods listed in his estate, remember we were talking about probate records earlier, includes a gundalo, which is this right here. Sometimes they're spelled gondolas in the records. What they are is it's a wide and flat bottom boat with a shallow draft. Basically what the draft is the distance between the water line and the deepest point of the boat. So it's the minimum amount of water required to float the boat. The Kennebec River is tricky. It's quite deep in places, but shallow near the shoreline as it is a tidal river. Here in Bath, where I live, in my neck of the woods, it can be as deep as 30 feet, which is perfect for giant warships, perfect for transatlantic schooners, but a little trickier for small little gundalos. Having a ship that can haul a lot of cargo, but have a shallow draft to navigate tricky parts of the river, like the chops heading into Merry Meeting Bay, would have been an enormous benefit to a sailor. Gundalos were a fixture in New England rivers since the mid-1700s, often used for harvesting salt hay along tidal rivers like the Kennebec. You can see wide, flat barge. Awesome. Zena was named executor of his father's will, and it's possible that the gundalo listed in Thomas's estate sparked an idea for Zena, who would build and captain his own ship 15 years later. Or perhaps Zena's neighbor, Elbridge Talbot, was another source of inspiration. Captain Talbot, another Black man, was born in Gardner the same year, captained a schooner out of Portland in 1853, and crewed entirely by Black sailors. After his father's death, Zena worked both as a seaman and as a small-scale farmer. He married a woman from New Brunswick named Mary, and his family grew to include sons William T., George C., and a daughter, Mary, who was called Etta. A Gardner Home Journal article from April 20th, 1870, reported that 15-year-old William, while playing with a pistol, shot himself through his left hand, and in the absence of his parents, took himself up by train to see a doctor in the city of Gardner. With his hand patched up, he then walked the 5 miles back home. So it was also reported on the Kennebec Reporter. This little article says here, accident last Monday, a son of Zena Lewis of South Gardner, aged about 14 years, while trying to force a ball into a pistol, accidentally discharged it, and ramrod and ball were sent through the middle of his right hand, shattering it badly. The little fellow's parents were away, and he went to a neighbor's, had his hand done up, took the afternoon train, came to the city, had his wound dressed, and then walked home, a distance of about 5 miles. It's entirely possible that Zena missed his son's medical emergency because he was hard at work building the vessel that would become his first lighter, launched in 1871 from Gardner. Zena gave his 48.6-foot scow sloop with a remarkable draft of only 2.6 feet, the formidable name Dreadnought. And with that, he became Captain Zena Lewis, the only Black captain on the Kennebec. Here is an example of a scow sloop. This is in the Portland Harbor. See, it's got very small draft. They're small, fast, lighters, perfect for ferrying cargo. It seems that Captain Lewis began immediately taking on freighting jobs with his vessel. He appears in an article in the Gardner Home Journal on September 13th, 1871, detailing the hazards of one such job. I'll go ahead and read this. Says, almost an accident. One day last week, while workmen were engaged in loading ice at the houses of J.L. Cheeseman on the opposite side of the river, a cake, an ice cake, weighing some 200 pounds, slipped from the gig used in hoisting the ice aboard the brig, and in falling to the deck a distance of about 15 feet, one corner of it struck Mr. Zena Lewis, who was standing by watching operations, directly on the head. Zena thinks had it been a white man, somebody would have been obliged to, quote, put a head on, end quote. But as it was, nobody was injured. Mr. Lewis was knocked against the rail of the vessel and somewhat stunned, but no bones broken. Shifting cargo is dangerous work on its own, and knowing that racial prejudice allowed the gig operator to not face any ramifications for his carelessness certainly would have weighed heavily on Captain Lewis's mind. Captain Lewis is mentioned frequently in local papers. His scow vessels were referred to as lighters. They were small and versatile, perfect for being able to navigate not only the shallows of the Kennebec, but the hazards of the open sea as well. Things like timber, lumber, and ice were shipped downriver, and goods that couldn't be produced in Maine, such as iron, sugar, flour, cotton textiles, were shipped up. Despite this constant, hardworking presence in the Kennebec community, racism cast a shadow over Captain Lewis and his family. A birthday party was thrown for his daughter Etta when she turned 21 and was covered in the Kennebec Journal with truly revolting racist language. I'm not even going to post it up here. You can look it up for yourself. It is disgusting to read. What should have been a joyous celebration for her was marred by deep prejudice. In May of 1883, Captain Lewis's newest scow, the Argo, was lost at Small Point, Maine, having dragged anchors and run aground. Here we have an example of another scow. You can see how absolutely laden it is with lumber. It's like all the way up and above. The man is like standing on it. Here's another example of a scow just completely laden. The Kennebec Journal, the same paper that mocked Captain Lewis's daughter's birthday party 2 years before, remarked that even though his loss was about $1,000, he has good grit and has contracted with the party in Perkins to build him a new one. So here's in the paper, the owner and captain of the lighter lost at Small Point Monday is Zena Lewis of South Gardner, and his loss is about $1,000. He has good grit and has contracted with the party in Perkins to build him a new one, to be done on the first part of July. The disaster was occasioned by the lighter dragging her anchors and going ashore in a gale. Just a few short months later in July, the Kennebec Reporter proudly reported that, quote, on Tuesday, Captain Zena H. Lewis had his new lighter towed upriver loaded with lumber, much like how this would have looked, end quote. Over the course of the next 2 years, Captain Lewis has roughly 12 articles written about him and his activities up and down the Kennebec from Portland to Bath to Gardner. Of those, the Kennebec Reporter itself writes about him 6 times. He would have been a familiar face to those along the river, ferrying goods from all over Maine. In early December, while hauling 52 tons of iron from Portland to a company in Bath, Captain Lewis's scow scoop Korinne was caught in a terrible snowstorm in Sagadahoc Bay, unable to reach the mouth of the Kennebec. We are very lucky to have Captain Lewis's own words taken from an interview he granted with the Bath Times. Quote, we intended to run up into the Kennebec, but a thick snowstorm set in and a heavy sea was running. The wind was then southeast and blowing heavy and the sea making fast. It was so thick that we gave up trying to get into the Kennebec, let go another anchor, and made preparations to ride out the blow. Wind steadily increased and thick snow, followed by rain, prevailed. The sea washed our decks during the night. We feared that the heavy sea would strain the scow and set her leaking so badly that she would go down, end quote. The crew persevered through the night, but discovered at 8 a.m. the next morning that the Korinne had sprung a leak. Taking on a foot of water in less than an hour and fearing for their lives, Captain Lewis and crew members Louis Doge and Charles Westorn made the decision to clear the deck of iron in an attempt to lighten the load. According to Captain Lewis, quote, to keep the Scow, which was fast settling, from going down, all hands set to work throwing the deck load over. We were obliged to hold on with one hand to keep from being swept from the deck and shove iron with the other. So you can imagine, this is another Scow schooner here. Imagine Captain Lewis, 2 other men in a winter snowstorm on the water, shoving iron off the Scow into the water, trying to save their lives. It's incredible. And the fact that we have it in his own words is just amazing. When all seemed lost, captain and crew happened to look up and see Captain Haley and the crew from the Honeywell's Point life-saving crew approaching in their own boat through the rough seas. Captain Lewis states that, but for the timely assistance rendered by Captain Haley and his crew, himself and 2 men must have been lost, as they never would have reached the shore in the small boat. The paper then reports that, quote, Captain Lewis is strong in his praise of Captain Haley and crew, end quote. Despite the hardships of repairing yet another ship, the foreclosure of his house, and other family trouble, Captain Lewis continues his work until the very end with determination and good grit so often reported on. The last time we see Captain Lewis in the newspaper is in the August 1888 issue of the Times Record, his obituary, fondly recalling Bath veteran lighterman. It says here, this is from the Times Record. Zena H. Lewis found dead on his cabin floor. For more than 30 years, a familiar figure on Bath waters has been the old colored lighterman, Zena H. Lewis. His home was in Gardner, but much of his time was spent near the city, Bath, and in running up and down the Kennebec. His craft was a large scow, which he managed with the assistance of one man. Last night, this man, finding the cabin rather close, went out on deck to sleep while the old man stretched himself out on the cabin floor. There was no disturbance in the night, but when the mate went below this morning, he found that Lewis was dead. Coroner Ballou was notified and pronounced the cause of death to have been apoplexy. The man had been ill for some time, and his death was not altogether unexpected. He was a familiar figure in Bath for more than 30 years, raising a family and making a living in the face of incredible odds. And as far as we can tell, he was the only Black captain on the Kennebec River. Maine's maritime history is rich and deep, and I'm glad to be able to tell the stories of some of the Black sailors who helped build Lincoln County and Maine with their good grit and determination in the face of dangerous work and discrimination. For every Black sailor whose name we know, there are surely dozens of crewmen who lived quietly and raised their families in anonymity, making the best life they could. May we remember them, and may we remember the contributions of the many marginalized people who helped build Maine and have continued to do so. Thank you. Here is a picture. This is the Mary E from, I think, about 6 years ago. So this is a site many Zena Lewis would have seen many times traveling up and down the Kennebec. I hope this talk was both enjoyable and informational. I'm going to put my email up on the screen. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me, reach out. And here are some sources that I highly recommend for further reading if you're interested in the subject, if you want to read more. Blackjacks, African-American Seamen in the Age of Sail by W. Jeffrey Bolster. This is sort of like the seminal work. This is like the one that everybody refers to when talking about Black sailors. Whaling Captains of Color, America's First Meritocracy. This is by Skip Finley, who is a historian out of Martha's Vineyard. This book particularly focuses on Black whaling captains and Black whaling crews, something I didn't really touch on. Here in Maine, whaling wasn't the big industry that it was in Massachusetts, but if that's something that's interesting to you, check that out. And of course, Maine's Visible Black History, which is sort of like the Bible when referring to any sort of Black history in Maine. It's a wonderful book, a wonderful resource, and I can't recommend it enough. So thank you again, Shannon. Thank you, LCHA, and thank all of you who signed up to be here for this presentation today. We couldn't do it without your support and without your interest. And like I said, please don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions. So thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Wonderful talk. I can almost hear everybody cheering through their mute buttons. This was really great. And I want you to know that the chat has been active through the entire talk. I've been getting a lot of little comments, observations, everything positive. I think people are very interested in learning more. So we might have to have you back for chapter 2. But
Of
I do
course.
I've got a few questions to throw at you if you have time for questions.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
And by a few, I mean a lot. So let's see what we have time for.
All right. I'm ready.
All right. Let's start with, oh golly, this is going to take some thinking. Okay. Cheryl had noticed on one of the screenshots that you shared that I think it was a list. Oh gosh, I think it was a list of people on a particular ship or something. And she noticed
Sure.
the names Nero Freeman and Cuff Freeman and asked, do you
Yeah,
think that those were men of color?
absolutely. Yeah. Sort of so one of the naming conventions for the people of African descent who are enslaved, there was this sounds so gross to say, but you sort of named the people you enslaved after like Rome, or Federalist Society were very much into like Roman and Greek Empire. So you would have named them things like Nero, things like Pomp. With Cuff in particular, that is actually an anglicization of a name from the West African Akan languages. So it's Kofi in the West African language, but the anglicized like how you would say it in English is Cuff. So Cuff Freeman, Cuff Miller, as we saw before, is named after. And fun fact, Kofi is the name for a baby boy born, I think, on a Sunday.
Wow.
So it's really neat to see how those names sort of survive the going through people who were enslaved and how people still have that connection to their heritage through names. But yeah, absolutely, would have very probably been men of African descent. So thank you
Right.
for that.
That's funny. I wrote back to her. We'll ask. Who knows? But it sounds like we do. So wonderful. Okay. Do you? This is from Dave Probert, who you know.
Hi,
He says
Dave.
he knows a William Lewis and his wife Mary in the Call Reed Cemetery. They're buried way in the back with their baby. They died in 1801 and 1802, and he wonders, do you have any sense that they might be the same Lewis family?
Oh, I don't, but I want to look into that now. So
Okay.
thank you, Dave. I'm going to make a note of that.
Hey, Corey,
Yes.
you had on one of the census sheets that you had that William was the son of, I can't remember the father's
Yes.
name,
He was a son of Thomas Lewis, but
Thomas Lewis, yeah.
he died at sea.
Okay.
I don't remember when.
Yeah, I'm just curious to know, William was born in 17, hang on a minute, I got it. William born in 1774, and he died October 15th, 1801. His wife Mary was born in 1777. She died a day later, October 16, 1801. But their son, Alfred, was born in 1801 and he died in 1802. So
Oh, curious.
the thing that is, these three are way off in the corner by themselves,
Yeah.
which I think is typical of African American slaves, where
Hmm.
if there are stones at all, typically they're off in the corner by themselves.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Dave, shoot me an email. I want to look into that some more.
Okay.
Thanks, Dave.
Yep.
Great
Thank
question.
you.
And keep me looped in. I'm curious too.
Sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Paul had a question I thought was really interesting. Is there any verification of any wages for the Black sailors?
Um, not like I can't find verification on paper, but I do know that Black mariners would have been paid the same as their white counterparts. Um, Typically how wages were paid out, at least in like the latter half of the 19th century, whereas that you'd receive half of your wages before the journey and half of your wages after. So I do know there was a man a free man of color in Salem during the same time period whose name was Charles Benson. He kept really extensive journals and he writes to like he was the steward, the cook, sort of did everything on board the ship. Took care of everybody when they were sick. And he writes in his journals that he was received the same amount of pay as the white men. So there wasn't really any discrepancy in pay that we would expect even today in year 2024. So they were paid the same wages. But I can definitely find you some of that information if you'd like. I can send you an email.
Okay, sounds like hit up Corey with an email for more. Okay, here's a pretty specific question. Do you know anything about documentation of any Black sailors near Fort Western, or do you know anything up in that part of the Kennebec River?
Ooh, you know what? Not off the top of my head, but that is definitely something that I am looking to explore more. My next project in my free time is looking for Black mariners in the Boothbay area. Seeing if I can find any maybe Revolutionary War sailors. I'm sure they were out there. Like I had said, documentation is really hard just because the record keepers haven't found that these records were as worth keeping versus the white sea captains. So I'm sure they must be up there. I haven't found anything off the top of my head, but I will definitely add that to my list of people to research. I know in like Thomaston, there was a really big Black community there. There was a lot of people going up and down the Western River. A lot of sailors, a lot of work going up and down the Western River, bringing goods for like the lime industry up there. So, but yeah, we'll definitely look into that more. So thank you for that. Sorry that I couldn't give you a specific answer, but
no, we don't expect you to know every single thing. For anyone who wants to maybe dive in and do a little bit of their own independent research, where would you say to get started?
Yeah. So you're obviously not going to have good results just Googling Black sailors Boothbay. It takes a lot of work and a lot of digging. They are there. If you have an account with like Family Search or Ancestry, a good place to start is census records, because censuses will almost always have a person's race listed. So you can sort of see family groups, you can see neighborhood groups in censuses. That's a good place to start. What else? I'm trying to think. Yeah, censuses are a good place to start. I found like randomly that like those town history books that were published in like the Victorian era, those have been a really surprising source. Like the history of Brunswick, Topsham, and Harpswell, written by Wheeler and Wheeler, I had mentioned like a Negro man lived in Topsham, and so like with that one little grain, we can sort of follow the thread, and then okay, so there was a Black man who lived in Topsham. Let's follow that thread. Let's see where in Topsham. We're going to look at census records. Probate records are another really good source too. People's like last will, what people own when they die. That's a really good source, because most of the time, if you know that a person was rich, and like Jonathan Bowman, they will often have enslaved people listed, human beings listed in their inventory. So sort of those little threads, kind of like little breadcrumbs in history, trying to find them as best you can. Like I said, it takes a lot of digging, but they are there, and it is worthwhile.
Thanks, Corey. It sounds like there are a few people in the meeting tonight who might want to do a little bit of their own digging, which is
Yeah,
great.
please do this. And
Join
this
club,
is
right.
right. And this is what's great about social history and great about having access to these digitized sources, is that there's no gatekeeping. There's nobody saying you can't research this. This research is for everybody. Anybody who's interested in this history should have full access to it and learn more. Because that's the way we're going to share history, and that's the way we're going to learn these people's names and contribute to a richer interpretation of Lincoln County and Maine and wherever you live. I will advocate 100% for the accessibility of archives. So that's my little soapbox. But yeah, feel free, like, please take my research, use it as a jumping off point, do your own research. I highly, highly encourage it.
I'm really glad you said that, because I think that, what I'm noticing through us offering these lectures with LCHA is that there is a huge interest in these stories that we maybe don't commonly know. And it's nice that you're encouraging people to say there's no gatekeeping. You can go ahead and start figuring out those stories, learning those names on your own.
Yeah, history is for everybody. So
yeah. Corey, I know we're running a little low on time, but are you good for a couple more questions?
Oh yeah, a couple more questions. Let's go.
Okay, one is just a helpful resource is apparently the National Park Service has some great resources regarding Black maritime history.
Yes, particularly Salem Maritime has a really great resource. Oh, if you look up like Essex National Heritage Site, they have a lot of really good history about, or a lot of great sources about specifically the North Shore of Massachusetts. And I know a lot of other historical sites are looking into bringing more of these histories to the forefront. So yeah, the National Park Service is great. I know like San Francisco Maritime Museum has a great source on their national park website. Um, like I said, just little breadcrumbs here and there that will get you what you want. But
Sounds like you just keep following them and you get what you can and keep going. I love that.
yeah.
Okay, next question. I thought this was a really helpful question is how much do we know about the lives of ordinary non-Black mariners in the 18th and 19th centuries?
Yeah, sort of even less because with sailors, there's a lot of paper. There are trails that you can find. There's crew lists, there's protection certificates, sometimes newspaper reports, as we've seen, but at ordinary people tends to take a little bit more digging. Census records, again, are a really great place to find those. It's where we found a lot of the free people of color in East Brunswick, a lot of Griffins. So that's a good way to sort of find people. As we get later into the 19th century and into the 20th century, city directories start to become a source to use. And those are also, they tend to be digitized on like archive.org. You can find people's industries listed there. So if a person maybe has like a haberdashery, or maybe a woman is like takes in mending, you can find names in the city directory. And then you can go check the census and see if they're a person of color or not. I found a lot of the people who had been displaced from Malaga Island had settled in Bath, and I was able to find in the city directory what some of them were doing for a living after they'd been displaced from their homes.
Thank you. I think this question, you may have gotten to this and now it's all kind of a blur, but would the jobs on board the ship be similar for a white man or a Black man? Yeah. Would they interchangeably do the same work?
They would have done a lot of the same work. A lot of things like handling the sails, hauling anchor, any of and those hard jobs would have been done white and Black side by side. Interestingly, if you were a Black man with not a lot of maritime experience, with not a lot of like seamanship, steward on board was often a job assigned to you. I lost my train of thought. Sorry. The Portland steamship, which went down in the big gale in the 1900s. One of the Houston boys was like Francis Houston from East Brunswick. One of his sons was actually a steward on board that ship. So it was sort of interchangeable, but there wasn't really any hierarchy as best I can tell, and especially in merchant ships too. It was just sort of like, can you work? Great, get on board.
I did one commenter saying that his understanding was that the cook was often a Black person. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, cook was often a Black person too. And sometimes on if you had a small merchant ship too, the cook and the steward were the same man.
Oh, interesting. Interesting. I don't know what this is. I'm sorry. I'm embarrassed, but I don't know what this means, bagadoose. But you have
bagadoose.
Seaman at bagadoose.
I know bagadoose. Yeah, so Bagad is the Penobscot expedition. It was a maritime battle that happened. Basically, the Continental Navy got the tar beat out of them, and they then made the trek from Bagadoose all the way back down to Maine, like on foot. That is something that I haven't done a ton of research into yet, but it is something that I want to. I'm sure there must have been Black sailors on board those ships during the Penobscot expedition in Bagadoose. But yeah, like I said, it's on my list of things to research. There's so much to research and so little time in the day, but yeah, I've been very interested in the Penobscot expedition, and Bagadoose. I have a couple books on the subject, so I'll have to consult those. And
all right,
yeah, email me. We'll talk about it.
I think I'm hearing email Corey to suggest more research topics, and it seems
Yes.
that the capacity is infinite. So we'll have you back many more times.
Yes. And I haven't picked my thesis yet for my degree. So
Wonderful. Well, I think that we're going to wrap up there. Corey, thank you so much. Oh, one more question just came in. And I think
sure. Oh yeah.
maybe I'll just send that to you separately because it's time to end. But thank you so much. This was really interesting.
Thank you.
Really, really appreciated it. And I just wish you the best of luck in your internship this summer. I know that most of the people on this talk will be curious to see what you come out of with that. If you have additional research or new ideas about research you might conduct here in Lincoln County.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again so much for everybody who's attended. We are so grateful, and thank you for supporting LCHA, and thank you for supporting citizen historians like myself. And thank you again.
Thanks, Corey. Would you fire off your email or tell me your
sure.
email last time, and I'll recommend that for everybody.
Sure. Let me share my screen one more time.
You people is the message I'm getting.
Yes. Let me share my screen one more time, and I will put that up here for you all. And in case you need me to say it, it is Korinne, KORINNE .Tanzer, TANZER @gmail.com. So yeah, please, I'd love to chat. I'd love to hear your guys' ideas. Dave sent me that information about the cemetery. I want to follow up on that. So thank you again.
All right. Thanks, Corey. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much for being part of this lecture series. And we're out. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.